If you're just joining us this afternoon, the weather is looking great, and any moment now we should see liftoff. The space program will be testing a crew compartment in orbit. For now, get this, landing on the moon? I'll tell ya, what a time to be alive, right? Okay now. Everyone, liftoff. We have liftoff. What a beautiful sight. Okay, the vehicle is going to be pitching due south here to...
From 1971 to 1973, N9SA conducted a massive multi-launch operation to develop vehicles and procedures that would eventually lead to an attempted landing on the moon. The following events would become the most terrifying experience in the space program's history.
Good light. Booster separation. Airway right on time. MECO. For second stage. Good light, good light. There appears to be a problem. Stand by. We see the same altitude divergence here. Telemetry. Gimbal unresponsive. Alright. Abort. Code 5. Repeat, abort. Code 5. We lost the vehicle.
This is the story of Lucky 7. It begins with the first experimental flight of the Icarus Pod, a spacecraft nearing go status for lunar missions. All that remains to fully qualify the vehicle are a series of activities in orbit of the Earth. This is the mission of test pilots and Kerbinauts Michael and Jack Kerman, who eagerly await aboard the sixth flight of an MXL launch vehicle. Yesterday, a docking target and zero-G test compartment initially meant for rendezvous by today's mission failed to reach orbit due to a gimbal failure of MXL's second stage. This problem occurred again today. Official procedure recommends the mission be aborted, but for a few moments, both flight and the pilots hesitate to say the word. Michael makes the suggestion of attempting stage 3 to orbit, and flight gives the go-ahead to do so. Plan works, and Icarus Pod 1 unfurls its solar panels in orbit of the Earth. This would mark the first time in 7 years Kerbals were once again in space. The previous mission being the flight of Icarus 4 in 1964. Due to budget and development restraints, the spaceplane program called Icarus has been on hold. The newly developed Pod variant, being an interim program, meant solely to fulfill mission directives for the first lunar landing. Their allotted mission time in orbit is 2 weeks, but the mission barely lasts for half a day. The spacecraft proved more power-hungry than anticipated in situ, and although this is not a problem while in view of the Sun, during the time spent veiled by the shadow of the Earth, power systems began to dwindle. This problem grew worse with each orbit, as the experimental nature of the power systems were not able to charge more power than what was lost in shadow. Critical life support systems were in jeopardy of malfunctioning, and carbon dioxide levels began to rise. Michael and Jack have no choice but to abort their mission merely 10 orbits in. their spacecraft now freed from the propulsion module, retro rockets are ignited to perform the emergency deorbit maneuver required to save the two pilots. This only proves half successful, but simultaneously complicates the treacherous predicament even further. While power dwindles to critical levels, reaction control thrusters refuse to respond to control for an unknown reason. This, in addition to slightly offset mass, causes the spacecraft to spin end over end at 2 revolutions per minute. Mike and Jack are currently nothing but passengers in a tumbling tin can, headed straight for a fiery entrance into the Earth's atmosphere at more than 7,000 meters per second. By nothing short of a miracle, as plasma begins to build around the capsule, atmospheric drag is able to reorient the spacecraft for re-entry just in time. Had it continued to tumble any further, the chance of survival for the crew would have been slim to null. Even so, they aren't out of the woods just yet. Only time will tell if the parachutes had survived the ordeal. Much to the relief of the pilots, parachutes had not been damaged by re-entry forces, and full deployment signaled the mission would not be resolved as fatal. Though surviving was a great victory in and of itself, the first 2 flights of the Lucky 7 program have now ended in failure, which isn't sitting well with anyone, and really isn't living up to the Lucky name. If N9SA is known for anything, as a reference to the Moonstone program or the Loner program from an alternate past reality, it is known for their supposed motto. That motto being, if at first you don't succeed, keep doing the same exact thing over and over again until it works. Though some are quick to label this insanity, this ideal has still proven to lead to progress somehow. An identical test compartment is launched into low Earth orbit, this time fixing the stuck gimbal of the MXL second stage, which plagued the first 2 missions. Successfully in orbit, the test article is powered and ready for its mission. Soon after, the crewed flight to rendezvous and dock with Outhouse is go for the mission's second attempt, this time flown by pilots Kermit and O. Kerman. Launching during the night will be more difficult for rescue crews should the launch fail on initial ascent, but tonight's mission is pushed forward regardless. Icarus Pod 2 reaches a rendezvous trajectory with Outhouse in low Earth orbit, and enters a coast phase for their flight, which will have them approach their target at a relative speed of 60 odd meters per second at a distance of almost 1 kilometer, in roughly 1 hour's time. This will hopefully demonstrate mission-critical and time-sensitive rendezvous practicality. As we will see later on, the Lucky 7 mission depends heavily on this aspect. But for the time being, Kermit and O reach their target, ullage their propulsion module, and fire their engine to halt relative velocity to Outhouse. With rendezvous complete, Outhouse is instructed to deorbit its upper stage. This was kept tethered in the case Icarus was unable to rendezvous, and the maneuver would have had to be performed by the test article instead. This, thankfully, was not the case at all. Icarus Pod 2 is an exact copy of the first vehicle. This, of course, means the same power failure is destined to occur should no other variables account for it. But this is where Outhouse will serve as a sort of lifeboat for the crew. It has additional power production, a far less power-hungry life support system which will allow the Icarus spacecraft to shut down its primary systems, and plenty of battery storage to survive in the shadow of the Earth. Also accounted for are re-entry reaction control thrusters not freezing up, but only time will tell if this problem will reoccur. The next phase of the mission will demonstrate, for the first time in the career, orbital docking of two spacecraft. As this is a crucial part of the mission, engineers made sure to go a little overboard with docking lights and indicators. Should this event happen in shadow, visibility should not be hindered on approach. N9SA pilots have trained extensively in rough simulators for this exact moment. But even so, in situ, nerves are high, stakes are higher, and slight mass imbalances in the spacecraft make it no easy task. Getting closer and closer, with many small corrections along the way. Contact. The two craft are now one. The crew can breathe a sigh of relief as they disembark and enter their new lifeboat, and the mission can proceed on schedule, ensuring the strange-looking crew compartment test article is officially given a go, no-go status for production of the actual lunar lander, which we'll see in a coming episode. Spending their time in orbit, Kermit and O determine their compartment will be adequate use for a lander design. With deadlines creeping up and no real alternatives available, it is chosen and the production process begins. Meanwhile, the crew of Icarus Pod 2 detach from Outhouse, perform a deorbit burn, and return to the Earth. Thankfully, the re-entry attitude thrusters perform nominally this time around, and the spacecraft is controlled through a relatively smooth journey back home. Now there remains one more aspect of mission planning to test: lunar-rated re-entry. In order to come back from the moon, the return vehicle has to, of course, survive coming back. Now we've sent O. Kermit on a trip around the moon in the throwaway but still career-saving SPUD program, but that was a mere flyby free return trajectory in a vehicle that had none of the capabilities as the also throwaway but hopefully career-saving as well Icarus Pod program. The next mission will vastly expand on the SPUD flight, as is necessary to demonstrate mission-critical lunar operations, which are required for a landing to occur. Today, well, tomorrow really, Icarus Pod 3 will set off on a mission to orbit the moon, and then return to the Earth. This brings to light a major limitation the space program currently has: launch capacity. With current launch vehicles, multiple launches are needed to lift enough mass to complete mission objectives. There simply isn't enough time to develop a new launcher given contract deadlines. So in order to reach the moon with enough fuel to capture and then return again, Icarus will need a little help. Well, a lot of help. That help is being launched ahead of time in the form of a large fuel tank and engine, which will help boost Icarus to complete this goal. This operation will be performed again during the Lucky 7 mission, should things go well during tomorrow's flight. "24 hours after the launch of Icarus Fueler 1, Michael and Jack lift off from Cape Canaveral aboard a brand new iteration of the Icarus Pod spacecraft. Their overall goal will will be the first two Kerbals to orbit the Moon. Reaching orbital velocity 250 kilometers from the surface, a trajectory to rendezvous with the fueler tug is calculated. At first, perspective-wise, orbiting their target, a small correction maneuver is all that's needed to bring them in close. Through this mission and the previous one, it is determined low Earth orbit rendezvous is a consistently performable operation, and one that will theoretically become routine in the future. Burning to kill relative velocity, Michael and Jack approach their target. Itching to prove themselves, though an unnecessary act, after the last mission's practical failure, the two pilots of Icarus Pod 3 decide to attempt a docking maneuver while still in a station-keeping rotation. This proves a bit sketchy and inaccurate in practice, but flight back on the ground closely monitoring the situation gives the go-ahead for final approach anyway. Successfully tethered, the fueler shifts as much fuel as possible to the spacecraft in orbit, this being the first ever spacecraft-to-spacecraft refueling in zero gravity, which happens to be another crucial aspect to the Lucky 7 mission. And now we can scratch that off the list. After fueling up, the refueler still holds a small amount of its initial fuel, and though not entirely necessary, it is used to push Mike and Jack into a higher orbit. This way, they won't have to use as much fuel as they otherwise would have needed to complete the mission. The targeted translunar trajectory will bring them back to the Earth via a free return, same as Spud. Should anything go wrong, since there are no rescue operations feasible at this point in time, they will coast back home on their own, safe and sound, so long as it's not a terribly time-sensitive problem that occurs, if any. Two burns are performed to bring Icarus Pod 3 into a low orbit of the Moon. The first will loosely capture into an elliptical orbit where a very low perlune is desired. The second will circularize the orbit at that lowest point. Completing this, the mission has arrived at its target destination. The two pilots spend one Earth day in lunar orbit, performing various extravehicular activities, monitoring systems, and in general enjoying the view this close to the lunar surface. Their spacecraft, no longer relying on low-tech and therefore insufficient solar power, is instead equipped with 4 fuel cells, using liquid hydrogen and liquid oxygen to produce electric charge. As this is the fuel used by the main propulsion system as well, the massive tank behind their capsule ensures they should have 0 power system failures like the previous design. In lunar orbit, Mike and Jack light up their engine for the last time, propelling themselves away from the moon's gravity well and targeting a specific re-entry angle into the Earth's atmosphere. Should everything go well, they will be back on the surface of the Earth in less than 3 days. The moon slowly shrinks in size behind them as they make their journey back home. Re-entry occurs without any problems, and the two pilots make it home safe and sound. The first ever Kerbals to orbit the moon. This concludes the testing phase of the landing program, and work begins on readying the most ambitious multi-launch operation in the space program's history. Next episode, in part 2, we'll be going over the logistical nightmare of bringing a fully fueled lander to lunar orbit with low-capacity launch vehicles. And then finally, part 3 will be attempting the landing itself. This was originally going to be one long video, but since this one's been taking a long time to edit, I figured it's best to break the video up into 3 parts instead. Thank you guys so much for watching, and peace out.